You expect certain things from the sea: salt on your lips, gulls carving the sky, the honest creak of timbers telling you exactly what you need to know. You expect maps that make sense and logbooks that follow a neat line from port to port. You expect, most of all, that stones and anchors and broken bull's-eyes are the quiet, knowable remnants of commerce and weather and human error. But sometimes the ocean returns objects that do not fit the tidy categories we keep in our museums and our lectures. Sometimes it returns an anchor so precisely crafted that its metallurgy argues for a foundry that no one has recorded, a rope not woven with techniques from 3 different continents, and with it a ledger stamped in a language no living person can read. This is why we are here, not to tidy the story, but to stand under it and listen. We will meet islands and deserts and river mouths where the past refuses to be polite. We will follow trade winds that cross cultures and centuries, and we will ask questions that have no neat answers. By the end of this hour you will have stood beside me on fog-lashed decks and in sun-bleached market squares, and you will, I promise, carry a handful of mysteries you cannot shake. From the first breath, imagine a cold morning when the fog hangs to the water like old cloth, and you can hear the distant clang of a buoy hitting metal. Imagine an anchor, impossibly large, surfaced in a fisherman's net, its stock carved with a repeating motif of waves and stars. Imagine that, a mile inland from the beach, the foundation stones of a tower align with the same motif. You think you know what you are looking at: a ship lost in a storm, a merchant fleet undone, and then the details pile up like promises breaking. There are trade beads in the sand, but they are made of a glass composition that predates the assumed arrival of glassblowing in the region. There are coins in a clay pot with a face that looks like a ruler from 2 different empires stitched together. There are bones that are too large to be comfortably human, and yet show the tool marks of skilled hands. We will not solve every puzzle today. We will, however, learn to listen to the holes in the record, to read the silences as carefully as the inscriptions. Because behind each unsolved mystery is a story of people who traded, prayed, loved, feared, and died, and that human thread matters more than any tidy explanation. We begin with a breath, with the sensation of salt and the belief that the sea keeps secret things for a reason. The merchant admiral's anchor will be our lodestone, but it is not the only oddity we will touch. There are graves laid out in geometries that don't match the cities that framed them, ceramics with glazed compositions that leap centuries, and ritual stones placed in alignments that reply to stars whose positions have shifted by millennia. We will travel to a marsh where wooden posts sank in peat and preserved a map, to a plateau where a city's walls suggest a siege that never happened, to a cove where the skeleton of a giant, the sort that inspires myths of sea monsters and lost tribes, seems to have been carefully interred with spices not native to that coast. In each place we will look at what was found and then at what the absence of evidence might be telling us. We will consider the practical and the poetic. We will challenge the received narrative without indulging in fantasy for fantasy's sake. We will use dates, measurements, and cultural names when they are known, and we will admit when they are not. I invite you, now, to picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, to feel the coarse sand under your boots, the hush of people waiting for dawn's first market call. Picture the anchor, cold, heavy, and carved with a language you have not yet learned. The first mystery I want to bring you to is a shoreline of gravel and basalt where a fisherman's net snagged something that should have belonged only to a ship's memory. Picture the scene, a low-lying coast strewn with smooth stones, gulls angling like punctuation marks, and a net hauled onto a wooden skiff. In the net, wrapped in seaweed, lay the merchant admiral's anchor, an iron anchor nearly 3 meters from crown to fluke, its stock fashioned from an alloy that, when tested, suggests a deliberate admixture of copper and a trace of meteorite-nickel. Radiocarbon dates taken from wooden fibers trapped within its corrosion point to a range centered around 1425 C, plus or minus a few decades. Yet the decorative motif, a repeating spiral with a central rosette, carries an iconography more common to coastal urban centers of the early 1st millennium BC. How do you explain an object that feels ancient in symbol but comparatively recent in material? That is the first thread. Historically, 1425 C sits inside a period of intense maritime activity. There were merchant confederacies navigating for spices and textiles. there were coastal principalities constructing fleets of dhows and cogs, and there were the slow gravitational pulls of empire. Coastal archaeology around such dates usually delivers kiln shards, rope fragments, and the occasional hull planking. An anchor, yes, but not one with integrated alloying and not of this pattern. Key discoveries around this stretch of coast included a ledger of sorts, a lump of hardened resin with impressions that resembled tally marks, and a scattering of trade beads whose chemical analysis suggests soda-lime glass with unusual traces of lead, pointing to either an experimental workshop or a lost trade route. Nearby, a set of foundation stones align north-south by 7 degrees, a number that recurs in other sites along the same coast, as if some architectural grammar had been passed between port masters. There are multiple competing theories. One says the anchor is a repaired ancient stock reused by later sailors, its tessellation of motifs and heirloom preserved and remounted. Another posits that a later maritime power had artisans who deliberately revived archaic motifs to emulate, and thereby legitimize themselves. Cultural revival is not modern. A third, more speculative idea suggests cross-cultural marriage or migration. Maybe a community of artisans from an older civilization maintained craft practices while integrating into new trade networks. We still don't know which explanation, if any, captures the full truth. But here's where it gets tricky. The bones found near the tower, spooned into a shallow pit and wrapped in fabric fibers preserved by the soil, belong to individuals whose stature, measured by femur and tibia lengths, exceed contemporary populations' averages by a marked margin. They are not monstrous in the sense of fantasy, but large enough to have drawn notice, and the butchery marks indicate ritualized dismemberment rather than casual scavenging. Legend in the nearby villages speaks of the long-armed traders and giants who walked the shoals, and folklore, as always, complicates archaeology. Now, let's be fair, folklore is not evidence. Still, these human-sized anomalies stare from the record and demand an explanation. Could nutrition, selective breeding, or genetic drift account for them? Perhaps. Could deliberate burial ritualizing an unusual body produce the pattern we see? Also possible. Or is there, perhaps, an unrecognized trading partner whose skeletal signature has yet to be placed into our comparative databases? Picture yourself running your hand over the anchor's fluke, feeling the pits made by centuries of oxygen and salt. Imagine the sound of gulls, the scent of resin, the faint whisper of a rope that once tied ledger to mast. From the shore we move inland along a ribbon of salt marsh and raised peat, to a place where the water table preserved wooden stakes and planks the way ice preserves fruit, with a clarity that makes the rest of the world jealous. Here, archaeologists found a series of wooden posts sunk in a precise grid, a plankway, perhaps, or a wharf. Radiocarbon returns tentatively placed the earliest features in the mid-2nd millennium BC, though later reworkings suggest prolonged use. Embedded in the peat near one particularly well-preserved post were beads of a vitrified substance whose chemical fingerprint maps onto a kiln technology believed to have emerged somewhere else entirely. The scale is significant. The line of posts stretches nearly 200 meters into the marsh and terminates at a stone quay whose stones were quarried hundreds of kilometers away. Trade clearly is implicated. The maritime trade routes of the region, reassembled from these fragments, suggest a web of exchange that is older, and perhaps denser, than the written records tell us. Key artifacts include a carved wooden token, the size of a palm, incised with a pictographic sequence suggesting commodities, grain, fish, a triangle that some read as salt. Nearby, shards show a glazed mixture containing traces of plant alkaloids used as mordants, a sign, perhaps, of textile production for export. Multiple hypotheses vie for supremacy here. Some scholars argue for a major center of production that has since been swallowed by the sea, a lost emporium whose economic heft attracted both artisans and sailors. Others suggest a seasonal aggregation site, where disparate coastal communities met at high tide to exchange goods and stories, and then vanished with the ebb. There's a third, darker possibility, that the site represents a displaced community, refugees from a war inland who took to the marsh and turned survival into craft. We still don't know which of these frames most closely mirrors reality. But standing at the peat edge, you can almost feel the imprint of movement, the rhythm of paddles, the smell of fish smoking on racks, the small, sharp conversations of traders. Picture yourself balancing on a plank while gulls keen above and tidewater sluices whisper against the posts. Consider how the miraculous preservation of wood and fiber complicates our sense of time. What seems recent may be ancient. What appears ancient may be a revived technique. Our third stop is a mesa overlooking a plain so wide the horizon looks like a suggestion. Up here, among wind-polished stones, there is a wall that refuses to line up with the rest of the city below. It is not a ruin of collapse but a terraced wall built at deliberate angles, as if the mason had been translating the flight of birds into stone. The masonry differs from the surrounding urban fabric. The blocks are larger, the bonding mortar contains a cruciform inclusions of pulverized shell, and the terraces step in patterns that track a lunar calendar rather than a solar one. Ceramics found in the fill include painted ware with motifs we recognize from coastal pottery hundreds of kilometers away. The dates, derived from thermoluminescence of the ceramic temper, run into the early 1st millennium CE, and yet the architectural grammar speaks to a tradition older than that. Key discoveries include an amulet of hammered silver with a hole worn smooth as if strung and a ceramic jar filled with an organic sealant, perhaps an herbal mix for anointing. The social clues are delicate. This appears to have been a ceremonial terrace, used seasonally by a group that marked time differently from their neighbors. Competing theories are vigorous. One line of thought views the terrace as the work of an immigrant cult, a group preserving an older cosmology and practicing it on the edge of a newer polity. Another theory argues for the terrace as an astronomical workshop where star positions were tracked for navigation, with the terrace serving as a practical observatory. A third proposes that the wall marks a boundary between social groups, a built palimpsest where one group's architecture was deliberately laid over another's. And then there is a mythic account told by shepherds who still graze the slopes. They call the site the Giant's Ledger, claiming their grandfathers found a ledger of bones here, arranged as the stars. Again, folklore is not proof, but sometimes it gestures toward truths archaeology only later confirms. Picture yourself at the top of the terrace at dusk, wind tugging at your coat, and the plain spreading below like a sleeping animal. Imagine the terrace under a full moon, its lines and edges casting long, unkind shadows. But let us not lose the thread of the merchant admiral's anchor. Far from being a single static relic, the anchor seems to radiate stories, each site touched by a cord that vibrates back to that coast. At a river mouth downstream there are docks whose timber shows axe marks not found in the shipwrights' manuals of the dominant culture. Analysis of the iron smelted for those docks shows a furnace design that uses bellows of a pattern seen only in inland river valleys. These crossovers are not proof of a single origin, rather, they suggest a network, artisans, captains, and ports trading methods along with commodities. Key data from this site include a partially preserved ledger written on thin sheets of beaten copper, scored with a repeated set of notches that may record deliveries. The sheets are corroded and unreadable, but under microscopy there are residues of plant pigments consistent with pigments used in cloth dyes. This hints at textile trade, but textiles leave few archaeological traces. We still don't know if these were coastal textiles exported to inland elites or inland raw materials refined on the coast. Next, recall the tall bones at the tower. They reappear in another place entirely. A burial grotto carved into limestone, sealed with a slab that bears the same wave and rosette motif as the anchor. Inside, the skeletons lie with grave goods that strike observers as curiously standardized. A pair of bronze bracelets, a carved bone comb, and a shard of mirror glass whose reflective surface contains metallic traces not local to the region. The burials show careful interment, not haphazard disposal. Some of the skeletons show healed fractures, suggesting a life of violence and recovery. Some have dental modifications, incisions filed into molars in a pattern seen elsewhere only among high-ranking mariners in an adjacent archipelago. One theory reads these burials as the final repose of an elite cadre, navigators or merchant captains whose status compelled ritual burial. Another reads them as captives, foreign traders who died far from home and were buried according to local rites. Still, for all the evidence, we do not have a single ledger or inscription that names them. The lack is maddening and beautiful, because it keeps the human element palpable. They were people with names we have not been given. The fourth landscape is an island cluster where the economy seems to have been built on the bones of the sea. Here, the shoreline is ringed with mounds of shells that, when sampled, reveal species brought from across ocean basins. Midden stratigraphy suggests a sustained industry of shell curing and bead production. Embedded in these middens were tiny carved discs, amulets, whose craftsmanship suggests a workshop tradition rather than household practice. Radiocarbon dates place intensive shell working between 600 and 900 C, but what makes the site stubbornly puzzling is a set of embedded iron rivets in a style used in ship construction 2 centuries later. The presence of these rivets in earlier layers could indicate intrusive deposition, but their condition, encrusted and fused into the shell matrix, argues against later contamination. Historians have floated several explanations. Some insist that sea level fluctuation complicated the stratigraphy, folding later material into earlier layers through storm surges. Others propose that the island hosted ritual feasts where objects from different eras were intentionally mixed as offerings. There's even a tantalizing suggestion that the island was a place of pilgrimage for mariners who carried tokens from their ships and scattered them as votive gifts. Picture yourself standing on one of those islands at noon, the sun burning the backs of your hands, with the taste of salt heating the air. Imagine rows of wooden racks drying shells, and the clink of small metal tools as hands work beads. Think of the amulet on your palm, its carved pattern worn by fingers who were both practical and devotional. Our fifth stop is a high desert caravanway that, at first glance, seems to have nothing to do with the sea. Yet here, in a series of stone-lined cache pits, were amphory shards with residues consistent with preserved fish oils and spices, maritime commodities carried inland. The caravan made use of camel trains that left hoof imprints in a hardened clay track, and alongside the route were small shrines with inlaid blue tiles whose pigment chemistry links them to a coastal kilning tradition. There are measurements, pits placed at intervals of approximately 12.8 kilometers, the distance a laden camel train might travel in a half-day, and the size of the amphory suggests standardized units of measure roughly equivalent to the anchor's ledger notches downstream. Key discoveries include a string of lead seals stamped with an emblem that matches a motif on the anchor's stock. This is the sort of connection that makes archaeologists sit up and recheck their labs. Competing theories range from organized state-sponsored trade caravans to decentralized merchant guilds using shared symbols as a form of quality control. We still don't have the definitive explanation for the emblem's meaning. Was it a trademark, a tax stamp, a guild mark, or a captain's personal sigil? And then there's the cavern beneath a cliff where a stone altar sits, polished by hands that left faint fingerprints preserved in the calcite. On that altar there are etchings forming a sequence, a set of numbers, or perhaps a calendar or a tally. The etchings are accompanied by an animal bone cut in a way suggesting ritual but with cut marks that mimic those of split planks, a symbolic conflation of ship and sacrifice. Perhaps the most perplexing artifact in the cavern is a small, bell-shaped object cast in an alloy whose microstructure suggests an experimental furnace technique. It rings when struck with a frequency close to the hum of the sea itself. The bell's composition does not match nearby metallurgical sources. Some scholars think the object is a navigational tool, a sounder for fog-bound coasts. Others posit a ritual function, a votive bell rung to calm the sea or call a spirit. Still, for all the fascinating ideas, the cavern keeps its secrets. Picture the cavern's mouth at twilight, the bell balanced in your hand, the echo of your strike rolling like a distant wave. Across these scenes run some common threads, networks that stretch across space and time, motifs that repeat in unexpected places, artifacts whose chemical signatures do not match their fine spots. Each piece of evidence opens multiple doorways, and none slams shut. That multiplicity is where the work lies. Consider the simple practice of knotting. Ropework found in shipwrecks along these coasts shows a complexity of hitch and splice that maps onto 3 knotting traditions known from different cultural spheres. To reconcile that requires imagining sailors and shipwrights teaching one another at sea, in the dim light of galley fires, in the same way languages borrow words. Or consider metallurgy. A furnace design crops up in a river valley and then in a port city, suggesting that either metallurgists traveled with their techniques or raw materials moved so efficiently that workshops duplicated distant practices. Both require human movement, and movement implies choices, alliances, and often violence. There are mythic elements because people living with these objects made myths. Villagers still point to stones carved into faces and call them the watching ones. In markets, old women tell the story of the merchant Admiral who kept a ledger of the sea and could, with a flick of his ink-stained finger, summon the weather. Giants walk the shoreline in local songs, their footsteps leaving depressions now filled with reeds. Lost tribes are whispered about in the way sailors whisper of rocks that bleed at certain tides. I am careful when I repeat these tales. They are not evidence in the empirical sense, but they are testimony to the human imagination that frames material remains. They tell us how communities make sense of dissonant pieces of the past. At each site, we must balance skepticism with wonder. Science disciplines the imagination, it forces us to test and to measure. Yet wonder pushes us to ask the questions scientists sometimes do not. Whom did this anchor belong to? What did the merchant Admiral keep inside his ledger? Why did that community inter the tall ones carefully? We will consider plausible, testable hypotheses, and we will also reserve room for the non-obvious. Sometimes the best explanation is a patchwork, a repaired anchor that has been passed down as heirloom, a stranded population that hybridized with newcomers, a ritual that absorbs objects from different eras as a way to tie present and past together. In the end, these unsolved archaeological mysteries matter because they attach names to the nameless. They refuse to be reduced to bullet points in a lecture. Each shard and post and ledger notch is a tether to a life lived. Our scientific tools, isotopes, microstratigraphy, metallurgical analysis, bring detail and sometimes closure, but they do not remove the poetry. We remain, after all, human listeners at the edge of the water, trying to tune our ears to the right frequencies. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. Picture a harbor swallowed not by a storm but by time itself, a broad, shallow bay where the tidal flats stretch like a patient animal and the shallow water carries the glint of broken things. Imagine standing ankle-deep in that salt and feeling the sea pull gently at your boots while the sunlight fractures across shards of pottery and a single, impossibly perfect bronze ring. This site, which locals call the hollow anchorage, yielded not one but a scatter of anchors, iron, stone, and most inexplicably, one cast in a copper alloy whose microstructure includes trace elements matching meteorite samples dated to approximately 1300 to 1450 C. Radiocarbon dates from organic material trapped in corrosion nodules roughly center on the early 15th century. Yet stylistically the anchors borrow motifs that archaeologists associate with emblems found in inscriptions going back to the first millennium BC. The scale of the site is telling. At least 20 distinct mooring points have been mapped across a 3-kilometer expanse, and sonar surveys reveal submerged pilefields extending 50 to 100 meters offshore and several lobes, as if whole docks once jutted into the bay. Key discoveries include a set of ceramic amphorae whose internal residues test positive for an unusual combination of spices, coriander and a plant resin whose biochemistry is currently being matched to only a handful of inland sources, and a wooden chest whose lid, when conservators carefully opened it, released the scent of old cedar and a folded textile dyed with a pigment recipe not known to local workshops. These are the hard bones of the mystery. Objects whose chemistry and craft refuse to sit in tidy maps. Historical context complicates things in delicious ways. The early 15th century was a time of shifting sovereignties. Coastal principalities were negotiating marriage alliances, mercantile charters were being drafted, and sea lanes were being contested by privateers and state navies alike. If we treat the hollow anchorage as a node in a larger trade network, the artifacts suggest a dual economy. A visible trade in commodities like salt and grain and a shadow trade in things that carry symbolic value, textiles, religious tokens, and perhaps mercantile guarantees represented by sealed rings and stamped amphorae. The carved motifs on some anchors echo iconographies found in inscriptions attributed to a city-state that flourished inland around 900 to 700 BC, a fact that forces us to consider revivalist aesthetics, or the long memory of craft guilds. Among the key data are microstratigraphic sequences showing repeated reoccupation, layers of silt, ash, and organic detritus deposited across centuries, interrupted by sand sheets consistent with episodic storm overwash. The human indicators are subtle but present: workshops indicated by slag pockets, linear distributions of worked bone and shell tools, and a cemetery where bodies were interred with a practiced ritual that included placing a small bell at the wrist. The bell's alloy does not match local ores and their tonal range is unusually low. When tuned, they produce frequencies comparable to certain tidal harmonics, which has led some to speculate about ritual practices linking sound and sea. Competing theories jostle each other like rival boats at a dock. One faction of researchers argues that hollow anchorage was a long-lived mercantile hub whose identities overlapped, a place where old families preserved archaic symbols to maintain legitimacy while operating modern trade practices. They point to the continuity in anchor motifs as evidence of guild identity. Another school suggests that the anchors and bells represent a syncretic liturgy, mariners combining a navigational tradition with votive practices drawn from several cultural traditions, which would explain the diverse chemical signatures. A third, bolder hypothesis posits that the anchorage was the locus of a diasporic community, artisans, sailors, and captive craftspeople from different world regions who developed a hybrid material culture in response to displacement, perhaps following a sea-borne revolt or a continental collapse. Still, for all these elegant models, the presence of meteorite-derived nickel in the copper alloy remains an awkward fact. Meteorite metal was prized but rare, and its use here could signal a high-status object, a ritual casting, or simply a one-off experiment by a metallurgist with access to unusual materials. We still don't know. Now imagine, if you will, the interior of a ship not as a single vessel but as a mobile workshop, boards smoothed by hands and time, benches carved with graffiti, a tiny hearth for boiling pitch, and an underdeck where the light is thin and the air is heavy with the smell of hemp. One of the more haunting finds associated with the hollow anchorage complex was a hull fragment with a plank length of nearly 8 meters, mortised and pegged in a method that combines lapstrake and carvel techniques. Measurements suggest a hull beam of at least 5 meters, making this a substantial merchantman by the standards of the period. Embedded in the hull's timbers were traces of rope twine fashioned with a knotting practice that, on close inspection, incorporates 3 distinct knot traditions: a Central Asian Turkic hitch, a Mediterranean bowline variant, and a Pacific-style splice. The obvious conclusion is contact. Sailors trading techniques across voyages. But when you trace the isotopic signatures of the timber, you find it was grown in a highland forest 200 kilometers inland, and dendrochronology indicates cutting dates that span a range implying repair over generations rather than a single build event. Thus the vessel, or vessels like it, may have been repaired repeatedly, repurposed, and passed down as heirlooms of a maritime community. Social clues pile up like timber. A ledger was found, or rather a composite of inkwood slats bound together with resin. The ink, when analyzed under gas chromatography, includes pigment particles associated with certain inland plant extracts used for bookkeeping elsewhere. The slats record numerals in a notation system of repeated strokes and dots, with occasional pictographic anchors beside entries, perhaps a medieval captain's shorthand for cargoes or payments. Nearby, a shallow barrio contained the skeleton of a woman interred with a set of bronze needles and a small leather pouch filled with beads whose glass composition aligns with a production tradition centered in a distant archipelago. The woman's bones show signs of repetitive stress consistent with activities like loom weaving or concentrated needlework. Perhaps she was a sailmaker or textile producer whose trade was as valuable to the ship as the cargo. Or perhaps she was a merchant in her own right, carrying the seal of a trading house. Our interpretive choices matter. They shape the social role we are willing to ascribe to objects and bodies that remain mute but for their material record. Let's be fair and consider the less romantic but equally plausible explanations. Taphonomic processes. The way things decay and move can fold later materials into earlier contexts, leading to apparent anachronisms. Storm surges, human reburial, or later intrusive pits could distort the picture. But sometimes the simplest explanation is also the least probable, that a single, exceptionally mobile trading network maintained continuity in symbols and techniques across centuries. The reality, in all likelihood, is somewhere in the middle. Trade networks are messy, traditions are copied and revived, and vessels and anchors travel not just goods but practices. Picture yourself amid this clatter, the hole under your palms, the inked slats slick with the sheen of old resin, the bell in your hand that hums low like a distant tide. Picture names you will never speak aloud, captains, wives, artisans, moving through an economy that linked sea and shore. We still don't know. Turn with me now to a different edge of the world, a high-ridge necropolis where the wind scrapes the earth raw and the stars seem a curtain closer than usual. This site, known as the Ridge of Echoes by those who live in the valley below, presents a different set of mysteries but one that is no less demanding. Here, excavations expose the complex of chamber tombs with corbelled roofs and doorways oriented toward a narrow band of horizon where, on the equinox, the rising sun bisects a cluster of distant peaks. The tombs range in length from 3.4 to nearly 7 meters, and inside many contain human skeletal remains laid out supine, arms crossed, and accompanied by goods, a copper mirror the size of a palm, a length of sewn leather that has retained stitch impressions, and most oddly, a cache of small, polished stones showing spiral etchings identical to those on the merchant Admiral's anchor. Osteological analysis places the primary burials in the late 1st millennium BC through the early centuries of the Common Era, but some tombs show later intrusions, and one chamber includes a secondary interment dated to the 10th century CE. The long chronology suggests the ridge was a place of ongoing significance for centuries. Key discoveries here include dietary isotopes measured from bone collagen indicating a surprising mix of marine and terrestrial protein, people living in a highland environment, but whose bones preserve signatures of fish and even marine-derived fats. The interpretation could be straightforward. Trade brought salted fish and preserved marine products inland. But the quantity and regularity of the isotopic markers suggest not occasional trade but systematic supply, perhaps the result of a ritual economy in which marine goods were ritually prized. Another striking feature is the presence, in several burials, of dental inlays, small grains of shell or faience fixed into molars and patterns we see on maritime captains' teeth in different contexts. This cross-site cultural marker suggests that certain identities cross the sea-land divide, perhaps seafaring lineages who retired inland and maintained the markers of their craft, or inland elites who adopted maritime emblems as symbols of prestige. There are multiple competing theories about the ridge's function and the identity of those interred. One powerful hypothesis frames the ridge as a sanctuary for maritime families who used the highland tombs as ancestral shrines, a pattern observed elsewhere where seafaring peoples maintain mountain cults. Proponents of this view point to the spiral etchings, a clear material link to coastal iconography, and to the ritual deposition of marine goods. Another theory interprets the ridge as a neutral burial ground used by multiple groups, perhaps as part of interregional marriage alliances where families interred members in a neutral sacred space to seal pacts. A different line of thought leans into a social stratification model. The ridge may have been the cemetery of an elite class whose trade connections afforded them marine luxuries, and whose burial practices were meant to display their cosmopolitan networks. And then there is the mythic layer. The valley people tell of a night when singers of the sea climbed to the ridge and taught the mountain people the songs of tides. They claimed the spiral stones hum when the wind is right. Myth is not a footnote but a lens. It tells us how communities narrate their past. Still, for all the careful osteology, the calibrated dates, and the isotopes, the motive force that brought sea and mountain together remains opaque. We still don't know. Now imagine sitting on the ridge at dawn with a steaming cup of thin tea, the wind tasting of distant salt though you are a full day's walk from the nearest shoreline, and feeling that old, small astonishment, how human life strings across landscapes like threads in a cloth. Consider the craftspeople below who might have labored over mirrors and sewn leather, the traders who packed amphorae into caravans, the families who tended tombs across generations. Picture the spiral stone amulet in your palm, smoothed by centuries of handling, and feel its weight as more than material. Feel it as proof that identities are not bounded by geography but stitched by practice. We still don't know. Picture the island cluster where shells rise like steps and the air shivers with heat, where every footfall stirs the ghost of a feast, and where the sound of small tools against shells still seems to echo across centuries. On these islets the middens are monumental, piled into terraces so deliberate they resemble low, white walls. Archaeologists counted layers and found, within them, not only shells and fish bones but the tiny discarded cores of bead production, the dressed teeth of sheep used as spindle whorls, and a scatter of worked metal fragments that refused to be tidy. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal lenses placed the primary midden buildup between roughly 600 and 900 CE, a period of intensifying maritime exchange in the wider region. Yet inside those layers, like cords that do not belong to the quay, are iron rivets and metal shims whose manufacturing microstructure belongs to a later period, arranged so securely in the shell matrix that mere stratigraphic contamination seems unlikely. The scale of bead production suggests an industry beyond household craft, workshops with apprenticeship chains, product specialization, and export networks. Chemical residues on shell beads show traces of pigments derived from inland plants, and trace elements in the metal suggest or sources hundreds of kilometers away. This is not a self-contained economy but a node in a long, braided network of exchange. But here's where it gets tricky. The rivets embedded in shells raise questions about ritual deposition versus practical discard. Some scholars read the rivets as intrusive, later visits to the island during a period of ship repair, when sailors left behind bits of their tools that sloughed into older middens during storm activity. Others argue for intentionality, that metal fragments were deliberately embedded into the middens as offerings, part of a ritual economy in which old ship parts were sacrificed to guarantee safe passage. A third possibility is more systemic. These islands served as way stations where old ships were stripped, their salvageable iron repurposed locally. The rivets are the mechanical flotsam of economies recycling maritime hardware. We still don't know which practice explains the pattern best. Picture yourself on the island, the sun making the shell gleam like broken bone, feeling the weight of accidental and intentional acts layered in each deposit. Imagine hands, small and practiced, carving beads while a bell hums in the background, and think about how an economy of votive gestures might look very much like a thrift of necessity. Turn inland now to the caravanway that binds sea and desert with rope and hoof, a ribbon of packed earth where shadows of camels stretch long at dusk. Here, in these cache pits lined with stones and filled at various times with amphory shards and salted fish residues, the evidence of maritime influence is unmistakable. Amphory standardized in volume, lead seals with emblematic marks, and the aroma trapped in pottery pores of oils and spices carried from afar. Measurements show cache pits spaced with machine-like regularity, between 12 and 13 kilometers, matching the distance a laden pack train could travel in half a day between water sources. These were not ad hoc traders but a logistical architecture, points where caravans could rest, exchange goods, and refresh supplies. The presence of maritime amphory and coastal tiles far inland, combined with wagon ruts and a scattering of leather that preserve stitch holes, reveals a complex choreography of supply and demand. This is trade on an infrastructural scale, not simply casual exchange. Now, let's be fair, the caravan theory is elegant, but we must account for anomalies. In one cache pit, a set of amphory contained not only fish oil but fragments of textile with dye recipes that, when modern chemists analyzed the compounds, matched coastal mordants used in a narrow coastal corridor. The lead seals stamped with a motif that also appears on the merchant admiral's anchor complicate matters further. Was this emblem a merchant guild's brand stretched across sea and land, a tax mark from a coastal polity, or a captain's personal sigil accepted by caravan leaders as a guarantee of quality? Competing theories range from state-coordinated supply chains provisioning inland elites with maritime luxuries, to looser federations of merchants who form temporary alliances to move goods through hostile territory. A darker interpretation suggests forced labor or coerced supply, coastal enclaves compelled by stronger polities to feed inland demands. Picture yourself beside one of those cache pits, the wind scratching at your face, and imagine the caravan rolling in, the low rumble of leather, the clack of camel hooves, traders bargaining while cooks set fires to warm preserved fish. Consider how supply networks shape social relations, and how a simple lead seal might be the most concrete evidence of trust among strangers. We still don't know the full human story behind these marks. Beneath the cliffs of another coastline, a cavern opens like a throat, and inside that black mouth a polished altar waits, its calcite smoothed by hands now dust. The cavern's finds are some of the most evocative: a bell that sings with a tone like the sea, etchings that could be a calendar or a code, and an animal bone cut with an intentional mimicry of plank split marks. The bell's alloy is peculiar, the microstrata of metal showing tempering techniques not local to the area. When struck, the bell produces a harmonic frequency that resonates with low tidal oscillations, an acoustic note that has led some to suggest it functioned as a fog bell or as part of a ritual intended to communicate with marine spirits. But here's where it gets tricky. Experimental acoustics show that a bell of that pitch would be audible only under certain atmospheric conditions, and a fog bell requires placement in exposed conditions not available in the cavern. Perhaps the bell was carried to the cavern for safekeeping, or perhaps the cavern itself was used as an enclosed sound chamber for rituals tied to maritime calendars. Competing readings must also contend with the etched scores on the altar. Are they numerals tracking lunar phases, a tally of journeys, or a different symbolic system entirely? We still don't know. Across the landscape of these mysteries run faint social threads connecting bell, anchor, and ledger. In a coastal workshop, a set of mirrors was made using a mercury amalgam technique recorded in other ports across the ocean, suggesting technological diffusion. In an inland market, a textile fragment bears a pattern identical to one carved into a tombstone by the ridge's artisans. These correspondences could be coincidence, the product of parallel invention, or they could reveal a network where artisans mirrored one another across distance. To understand such diffusion, imagine artisans traveling not as migrants but as carriers of practice. A smith goes to sea, learns a new tempering trick from a visiting captain, and then returns inland to teach the trick to neighbors. Material culture thus becomes a language of gestures passed hand to hand. The metaphor is useful because it reminds us that objects speak of movement and of the human choices that create patterns. There are also darker, more sensational echoes that communities still whisper. A cache of giant bones under a sand dune, said to belong to the sea giants. A ledger that curses whoever reads it aloud, and stones that bleed when struck at certain tides. I repeat these tales not for theater but because they shape local behavior. They determine where people will dig, what they will carry home, and what stories they will tell children at night. Archaeology, as a discipline, must hold two kinds of truth together, the physical and the narrative. When local song and radiocarbon dating disagree, either is necessarily wrong. They are different ways of structuring memory. Picture yourself at twilight on a sand dune, the wind taking up a tale of giants and ledger curses, and think about how myth preserves outrage and wonder when written records fail. Let us go now to a plateau city whose walls ascend like the ribs of a sleeping beast, where terraces step in patterns that suggest both defense and ceremonial display. Excavation here uncovered a series of chambers densely packed with pottery, and in a central plaza a cache of weights bearing scales incised with anchor-like notches, the same notches found on a ledger slab near the hollow anchorage. The weights suggest a standardized system of measurement across maritime and inland economies. They are a small but potent sign of integrated commerce. The wall's masonry shows successive rebuildings, each employing different stone finishing techniques, implying a city that altered its identity over time as different workforce contingents took charge. Among the fine assemblage were foreign amphorae, imported beads, and an inlaid gaming set whose pieces are carved from the same shell quarry identified on the island middens. The distribution of goods suggests a city plugged into long-distance circuits of exchange, not merely a local hub. Scholars debate whether the plateau city's cosmopolitanism was imposed by conquest, cultivated by trade, or chosen by elites as a deliberate sign of prestige. One narrative frames the city as a mercantile embassy, a place where merchant houses established permanent lodges, complete with customs to process goods and adjudicate disputes. Another sees it as a kind of cultural palimpsest, successive waves of artisans and captains imprinting their craft upon the same stones, leaving traces of earlier styles to be reinterpreted by later generations. Still another reading sees ritual appropriation, local elites adopting maritime symbols to display connection to distant gods, ancestral routes, or trade partners. Be careful with such interpretive leaps. Material similarity does not equal identity. Picture yourself in the plaza, sunlight cutting the terrace edges sharp, children running between piles of pottery, and feel how the city, like a manuscript, has been rewritten by many hands. We still don't know which story best captures its past. Across these sites, from cavern to caravan, a recurring question demands our attention. Why do certain motifs persist while others disappear? Why does the anchor motif thread through coastal bell, inland tomb, and caravan seal? One hypothesis posits a durable corporate identity: merchant families or guilds who use symbols to mark property and guarantee trust. A rival hypothesis places ritual at the center, symbols carried not as business marks but as sanctifying devices that made trade sacred. And a third supposes pragmatic diffusion, symbols spread because they worked, easy to carve into anchors, simple to stamp on lead, visually distinct on a ledger. Each theory carries implications for how we imagine agency in the past: economic, spiritual, or practical. We still don't know the answer, but the very multiplicity of possibilities is a kind of archaeological abundance. It shows that the past was not a single tale but many. Imagine, finally, standing at the edge of a mapped grid of the ancient world we have followed: the hollow anchorage, the peat-lined wharf, the terrace observatory, the ridge of echoes, the island middens, the caravan caches, the cavern altar, and the plateau city, each a bead on a thread, each showing both its specificity and its interconnection. Picture the anchor again, cold and articulate, its rosette motif now carrying echoes of bells and caravan seals and spiral stones. Picture the people who made, used, and buried these things: captains nerving themselves before a storm, women threading beads by lamplight, caravan leaders balancing trust and profit across miles of sand. Think of how their lives braided together through trade, ritual, migration, and invention, and how every recovered fragment is an invitation to imagine the rest. We still don't know all the answers, but in the not knowing there is room for reverence and for further inquiry. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. Picture, now, a drowned city whose streets lie like bones beneath a shallow turquoise, where sunlight fractures through water and turns stone into a mosaic of light and shadow. This place, once a thriving port whose name has been lost to silt and speech, revealed a pattern of streets and quays that do not conform to any single urban plan we recognize. Here the blocks measure roughly 30 to 40 meters across, and the quay stones are dressed with a mason's mark repeated every 12 courses. Radiocarbon samples from sediment layers suggest major occupation between approximately 700 and 1100 C, with earlier foundation deposits hinting at activity stretching back into the 6th century. Key discoveries include carved lintels bearing inscriptions in a script that mixes linear signs with curvilinear punctuation, not quite any known alphabet but suggestive of mercantile shorthand, and a concentration of weights stamped with a star and anchor emblem. Structural remains show a curious blend of architectural vocabularies: post and beam warehouses with Mediterranean-style barrel-drained roofs, and stone-lined cellars common to inland granaries. The material mix implies a port that handled both bulk trade and high-value, symbol-heavy goods. But here's where it gets tricky. Sonar surveys reveal submerged bas-reliefs depicting a procession of large, cloaked figures carrying an enormous object that some interpret as a ledger board. The bas-relief style is archaic. The imagery of procession with ledger implies an institutionalized accounting practice, a bureaucratic ritual of exchange rather than ad hoc barter. Competing theories suggest this was either a mercantile republic with formalized trade rituals, a religious brotherhood that administered commerce as sacred duty, or a fortified pirate haven that masked its economics with ritual pomp. Myth persists on shore. Fishermen speak of a sleeping gatekeeper who counts the waves and only opens the harbor to the worthy. Picture yourself diving over that quay, the water cool on your mask, and imagining the ledger: a weathered plank scored with tally marks, water smoothed by hands no longer living, the anchor emblem beside the strokes, a finger pressed to the score as if testing memory. We still don't know who kept the ledger, and we still do not know why they chose to mark trade in stone as well as on wood. Move inland in your mind to a freshwater lake high in a rimland basin, its surface glassy, bordered by reeds, and in the shallow stumps of an ancient submerged forest stand like the ribs of a ship. In that water archaeologists found a remarkable wooden map, planks cut and joined and laid with pegs and grooves not unlike a board game but scaled to coastal topography. Dendrochronology dates the timber to the late 1st millennium C, and inlaid resin-preserved pigment patterns that seem to encode compass bearings linked to stars. Nearby were paddles with carved notches that matched the board's motifs, and a cache of small, fired clay tokens representing goods, grain, fish, beads, tucked into waterlogged niches. The interpretation that best fits these finds is that this was a navigator's planning table, used not for play but for instruction and rehearsal. The board's construction suggests a communal pedagogical device, apprentices learning to read currents and stars through tactile play. But here's where it gets tricky. The map board's grooves show wear on areas corresponding to routes no longer navigable in the present shoreline, a direct witness to shoreline change and sea level shifts. And the tokens, chemically analyzed, include residues of oils from plants that grow only in coastal marshes far from the lake, indicating either long-distance exchange or a ritualized borrowing of maritime power in inland waters. Competing theories range from a localized teaching device for inland mariners who service riverine trade to a transplanted coastal practice carried by refugees who settled the basin after conflict. Picture yourself kneeling at the board, fingers tracing carved channels, imagining the voice of a teacher saying, "When the moon slides here, steer for the reed line," and recognize the intimacy of knowledge passed hand to hand. We still don't know whether that board taught navigation, told sacred stories about the sea, or did both at once. Now picture a desert ruin, a linear city of sun-baked brick and wind-polished column bases that mark a caravan way turning inland, where an astonishing find was made beneath a collapsed arcade, an archive of thin copper plates tied with leather cords and sealed with lead nodules bearing the anchor emblem. Conservation revealed inscriptions in a shorthand of strokes and anchors that, when read sequentially, appear to be account entries, quantities, prices, names, and what might be the equivalent of received marks. Metallurgy shows the plates were hammered from a mix of copper and tin with trace elements linked to ores in a coastal range 200 kilometers to the south. Radiocarbon associated with the binding leather dates the assembly to roughly 980 to 1020 C. The archive's existence in a desert city suggests a bureaucratic structure serving a mercantile network that bridged sea and sand. But the plates are deliberately opaque in places. Gaps, intentional burn marks, and ink blots suggest censorship or ritual erasure. Perhaps someone attempted to hide or sanctify parts of accounts. Competing theories are stark. Were these merchant ledgers intended to travel with caravans for contractual enforcement? Or were they votive depositions memorializing agreements? A myth local to the desert outskirts tells of a merchant admiral who would carve his oath onto plates and bury them at crossroads to bind traders to truth. The plates, in that telling, are both contract and relic. Picture yourself kneeling among the sun-cracked tiles, the leather cold under your palm, and feel the weight of promises counted in metal. We still don't know whether those plates were paused in time by accident, or deliberately silenced by human hands. Shift your gaze now to a river delta where silt traps the artifacts of human life with the tenderness of an archivist. This delta yielded an astonishing assemblage. A ship's bell inscribed with a sequence of pictograms matching tokens found in the caravan cache pits, an anchor stock carved with a repeating knot pattern, and most bewildering, a set of wooden tablets whose surfaces are incised with an inventory notation that includes the word for salt, in a language otherwise unattested in the corpus. The delta's sediments preserve a surprisingly intact snapshot, rope fibers, the soot of hearths, and a braided textile fragment that matches a dye-vat recipe recovered on the island Middens. The context suggests that the delta served as a transshipment zone where maritime commodities were repackaged for inland movement. Competing theories emphasize either formalized port administration, a state-backed warehouse complex exchanging goods on set tariffs, or a patchwork of independent merchants cooperating through informal norms. There are also tales of a salt serpent, a shoal that, according to seafarers, moves to swallow dishonest ships. Its legend may encode bathymetric hazards that forced mariners into particular channels, and thus into regulated spaces where trust could be enforced. Picture yourself waiting in the delta, lifting a bell to your ear and hearing a muted, sea-remembering tone, and imagine the ledger-like tablet with salt scratched on its face, a word that both names a commodity and signifies survival. We still don't know whether those pictograms record market prices, ritual obligations, or both simultaneously. Consider, too, the cluster of skeletal remains found interred in a circular formation on a windswept spit, tall, robust individuals whose long bones show muscular attachments consistent with extreme physical labor, pulling, hoisting, and constant standing. The grave goods include iron tools modified in ways consistent with both shipwright and butcher implements, and a small assemblage of carved bone tokens inlaid with shell. Osteobiography suggests a communal identity. These were not prisoners but members of a working cohort, buried with implements of their trade and the markers of solidarity. DNA analysis, where preservation allowed, indicates a genetic diversity wider than expected for a small island community, implying either a cosmopolitan recruitment pool or mixed ancestry across several maritime populations. One straightforward theory reads this as the graves of a specialized guild, perhaps long-distance sailors tasked with salvage or towage, while another frames them as victims of an epidemic whose bodies were ritually interred to prevent contagion. Mythmakers on neighboring shores tell of the towing folk, people who could haul sunken hulks ashore using only ropes and song. Picture yourself sitting on that spit at sunset, the bones white in the dim, and feel the human architecture of labor, how craft binds bodies together and how death, when communal, becomes a claim on memory. We still don't know what exact social structure bound these people, guild, kin, or coerced labor, but we can feel their cooperation like a tension line between two masts. Finally, in this sequence, imagine a cliffside shrine where a polished stone basin collects rain and where, around the basin's rim, inscriptions spiral like water eddies. Excavation exposed votive objects, tiny anchors carved from bone, miniature oars, and small fossilized marine shells placed like offerings. The inscriptions, when carefully revealed, are not simple prayers but lists, names followed by notches, resembling an oath roll. The linguistic analysis suggests a blend of three language families: a coastal tongue, an inland tongue, and a third idiom appearing sporadically as personal names that match names on the caravan lead seals. The shrine thus functions as a ledger of memory, vows made, debts remembered, people honored. One reading sees this as a protection cult for mariners. Another sees it as civic bookkeeping where the shrines served as a public registry. Local storytellers say that if you toss a coin into the basin and the ripples reach all the way around twice, your debts will be settled in the next tide. Picture yourself leaning over that basin, watching ripples circle like small transactions, and imagine the names carved into the rim as a human chorus of promises. We still don't know how literal those promises were, legal contracts or symbolic acts, but they show how commerce and faith braided together. Across these segments we see the same braided logic. The sea offers material goods but also instills social forms, guilds, rites, and symbols that travel inland and refashion terrestrial landscapes. Anchors become emblems, ledgers become sacred objects, bells oscillate between the practical and the ceremonial. And through it all, human actors, captains, caravan leaders, artisans, and the families who fed them, make choices that leave traces both robust and maddeningly incomplete. Imagine tracing those choices like a seam running through geography. The stitch disappears and reappears, but you can follow its general direction. We still don't know the full pattern, and for that very uncertainty we are indebted. It invites us to keep looking, to keep testing, and to keep listening to the voices both of science and of story. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. There is a particular hush that descends when you step back from the tangle of details and hold the whole pattern against the sky, and it is in that quiet that the true payoff of these mysteries arrives, not as clean answers but as a renewed sense of who we are when history refuses to be polite. Across coasts and caravanways, cliff shrines and peat wharves, the traces we've followed, the merchant admiral's anchor and its spiral rosette, the bells that ring at tidal frequencies, the caravan lead seals, the copper plates with burned-out entries, the drowned ledger in bas-relief, the island middens stacked like low altars, begin to read less like isolated curiosities and more like notes in a single, sprawling score. We have seen objects that are at once practical and performative, anchors that secured ships and identities, bells that warned of fog and summoned deities, ledgers that recorded commerce and carved oaths into metal. We have encountered metal alloys touched by meteorites and glass whose chemistry points to faraway workshops. We have traced knot forms that carry the fingerprints of distant seas across planks rooted in inland forests. And we have listened as myths, giants on the spit, the tallying gatekeeper of the drowned harbor, the towing folk who hauled hulks with song, insist upon a human grammar that material analysis alone cannot fully translate. When you step back, the outline that emerges is not a single map but a braided topology, networks of trade and trust, itineraries of craft and ritual, economies that converted raw materials into social obligations, and communities that kept old symbols alive while adapting techniques new to their hands. The anchor motif recurs not simply because it is easy to carve but because it does a kind of cultural work. It identifies, it sanctifies, it guarantees. The bell both rings and sanctifies. The ledger both accounts and binds. These are hybrid objects because the people who made and used them lived in hybrid worlds. Mariners who married inland women, artisans who apprenticed in foreign ports, caravan leaders who honored shrines on the way. This hybridity complicates tidy narratives of diffusion versus independent invention. It asks us instead to imagine a past made by messy human choices, by repair and adaptation, by families that lived with one foot in two worlds. Consider what our methods have taught us about that messiness. Isotopic analysis transformed a single bone into a diary of diet and journey, revealing fish oils and mountain burials and inland dyes preserved on shells and island middens. Metallurgical microstructure made a bell speak of furnaces and traveling smiths. Dendrochronology turned timbers into calendars. Stratigraphy exposed the palimpsest of storm, reuse, and ritual. Each technique is a lens that brightens parts of the scene while leaving others in shadow. When radiocarbon gives a date and folklore gives a name, we cannot choose one and discard the other. We must walk the thin line between them, allowing measured skepticism to check our appetite for wonder while letting wonder prompt questions science might not yet know to ask. The result is a historiography that is deliberately partial and impatient. Partial because no single technique resolves every contradiction. Impatient because the very contradictions compel further excavation, reanalysis, and conversation across disciplines. The past, in other words, resists settling into a simple narrative, and perhaps that is its greatest lesson for us. History is not a fixed monument to be admired from a distance but an argument to be engaged with, a dialogue across centuries in which our questions matter as much as the objects themselves. There is a human lesson, too, tucked into the sediment and the ledger. People in the past faced the same mixture of risk and possibility that defines our lives today. They balanced profit and safety, trust and deception, memory and innovation. They created symbols to manage uncertainty, marks on anchors, seals on lead, inscriptions on bas-reliefs, and those symbols became portable forms of social currency that allowed strangers to transact with one another. They also created rituals to reframe loss, offerings on middens, bells in caverns, oath rolls at cliff shrines. In many cases, the sacred and the commercial did not sit in separate compartments. They braided into a single practice because commerce required trust, and trust required witnesses, gods, shrines, and public ledgers. When a caravan leader and a sea captain shared a lead seal, they shared not only goods but a code of honor. When a family buried their tall kin with bells and mirrors, they made a public claim about identity and status. These are ordinary acts with extraordinary consequences. They shape kin networks, crafts, and the very curvature of exchange across continents. We must also reckon with the costs of our curiosity. Digging up middens and prying open chests disturbs places that remain sacred in modern lives. The dead we study are ancestors still honored by living communities. Everywhere we work, we enter dialogues with people whose stories and songs unfold the same objects we analyze. Ethical archaeology demands that we listen not only to the laboratory instruments but to local voices, that we treat myth not as an obstacle to be cleared away but as part of the evidence landscape, one that may carry encoded knowledge about hazards, routes, or rites. The fishermen who point to the sleeping gatekeeper of the drowned harbor, the elders who still sing the towing folk into memory, the desert storytellers who speak of merchant plates buried at crossroads. These are partners in historical reconstruction, not obstacles to it. They remind us that material fragments are not purely inert data but things embedded in living worlds of meaning. And yet there is another, quieter urgency here, the physical fragility of the record. Sea level rise, coastal erosion, storm surges, and human development are erasing context as fast as we can examine them. The submerged quays and drowned bas-reliefs are not only evocative, they are time-sensitive evidence threatened by the very climate shifts that echo the ancient shoreline changes the mapboard recorded. Middens compacted into terraces might be bulldozed for coastal development. Peat-preserved planks can rot if drainage patterns change, and desert archives can be exposed to looting the moment they are uncovered. To keep digging, therefore, becomes both an intellectual imperative and a public responsibility. To document, to preserve, and to do so in partnership with the people who live in those landscapes now. That imperative reframes archaeology as an act of stewardship, a discipline that must balance the hunger to answer questions with the obligations of care. So what have we learned? What can we reasonably claim after tracing anchors from the hollow anchorage through caravan seals to plateaus, cities, and cliff shrines? We have learned that the past is not a set of discrete cultures neatly boxed by geography. It is an ecology of practices that migrate, reappear, and recombine. We have learned that objects are social actors. Anchors do more than hold ships, bells do more than warn, and ledgers do more than count. They make social space possible. We have learned that identity is both local and portable. People carry names, tools, and debts across miles, and these things contributed to social belonging as much as they carried economic value. And perhaps most importantly, we have learned that unanswered questions are not failures, they are invitations. The meteorite-nickel in the anchor alloy, the spiral motif recurring in tombs and shrines, the caravan lead seals repeating an emblem across miles. Each unresolved item is a hinge opening toward further exploration, new methods, and conversations that include voices beyond the lab. Look, too, at what these mysteries teach us about how to imagine the future of study. Interdisciplinary collaboration, metallurgists with ethnographers, dendrochronologists with local historians, acousticians with ritual specialists, must be the default if we hope to approach the past's complexity honestly. We must combine hard data with lived testimony. We must publish datasets as well as stories. And we must prioritize preservation so that future technologies, perhaps isotopic techniques not yet invented, will have something to analyze. The anchor's rosette may yet disclose a name under a new imaging technique. The burnout sections of the desert plates may yield legible ink when new reagent methods are refined. Our models must be humble, adaptable, and explicit about uncertainty. When we say, "We don't know," we are not conceding defeat. We are marking the frontier of knowledge and inviting others to bring fresh angles. Finally, we must not let the romance of mystery eclipse the dignity of the people who left these traces. These were not anonymous abstractions but living, breathing communities, families and guilds, traders and captains, who faced real hardships and real loves. When we stand beside the merchant Admiral's anchor, when we listen to a bell found in a cavern or run our fingers along a ledger plate, we should not treat these things as mere props for dramatic narrative. They are, instead, evidence of lives lived with skill, strategy, and remembrance. The tall bones in the spit were bodies that worked together. The mirror in the ridge was polished by a hand that loved its reflection. The beads in the island middens were threaded by fingers warmed by lamplight and song. Our scientific curiosity finds its ethical counterpart in empathy. The empathy to imagine the flavors, sounds, and daily textures of those lives, and the humility to report our findings in ways that add to communal knowledge rather than diminish it. So, where does that leave you and me after this hour of wandering through unsolved archaeological mysteries? It leaves us with richer questions and a bracing awareness that history is a conversation, not a lecture. It leaves us with the sense that the past refuses easy closure because life itself refused it. Because people made choices that spread across space and time in beautiful, messy ways. It leaves us with a renewed appetite for careful, collaborative inquiry and a clearer sense of the responsibilities that come with uncovering the past. And it leaves us with stories, some tested by science, some retained in song, stories that make the world stranger and more intimate at once. If you feel, after all these dives and digs, a tug toward the shore where those anchors lie, know that the tug is shared. Archaeologists, conservators, local communities, and curious listeners are all pulled by the same tide of wonder. Take that pull seriously, treat the objects and the people attached to them with care, and when you stand once more beside the water or the caravan track, listen. You may hear, under the gulls and the wind, the scratch of a tally, the faint ring of a bell, the whisper of a knot being tied, a human chorus threaded across centuries. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.